It took me 71 years to admit something I should have seen much earlier. My name is Robert Hale. I'm 71 years old and I spent 28 years in the Army, most of them as a platoon sergeant responsible for training and shaping young soldiers. And somewhere along the way, I realized I trained those young men with more patience and intention than I raised my own son. When you're in the military long enough, leadership stops being a task and starts becoming a part of your identity. I was in my early 30s when I first took charge of a platoon. Most of the soldiers were barely out of high school. Some of them were confident. Some were scared and trying not to show it. All of them were watching me more closely than I understood at the time. I took that responsibility seriously. I learned their strengths. I corrected their weaknesses. I stayed late to make sure they understood what was expected of them. If one of them struggled, I pulled him aside and talked it through. Not harshly, firm, yes, but measured. I believed a good leader didn't just demand discipline, he built it carefully, brick by brick. At home, things were different. My son was born during my second year overseas. I met him when he was 3 months old, holding him in a small living room that already felt unfamiliar because I had missed so much of it. I told myself I was doing all of this for him, for my family. That's what we say when we wear the uniform. We say it's for something bigger. But what I didn't see then was that while I was learning how to shape young men into disciplined soldiers, my own boy was growing up without the same steady attention. When my son was 5, I corrected the way he stood at the dinner table before I asked him how his day had been. When he was 10, I focused more on his grades than on the quiet frustration in his eyes. I expected him to respond to structure the same way my soldiers did. Clear rules, clear consequences, minimal explanation. It worked in the platoon, it didn't work in my house. In the Army, when a young soldier made a mistake, I saw it as a teaching moment. I asked questions. I explained the why behind the standard. I made sure he understood that correction wasn't rejection. It was investment. With my son, I assumed he should already understand. I assumed he knew I loved him even when my voice was sharp. I assumed my silence would be interpreted as strength. There was a moment that still sits heavy with me. My son was 16 and we were standing in the garage after an argument about something small. I don't even remember what started it. I remember his face though. He looked at me and said, "Well, I feel like one of your recruits, not your kid." At the time, I dismissed it. I told him he was being dramatic. I told him discipline builds character. That's what I believed, though that's what had built me. You know, years passed. He moved out. He built his own life, and we stayed in touch, but there was a distance neither of us named. Our conversations were polite, surface level, safe. When I retired at 60, I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt disoriented. The structure was gone. The daily leadership, the responsibility, the young faces looking to me for guidance, all of it disappeared almost overnight. For the first time in decades, I had time to sit with myself. And that's when the comparisons began. I would think about a soldier who struggled with confidence and how I patiently mentored him for months until he found his footing. I would remember the long conversations I had with the young private who was unsure about his future, how I encouraged him, how I listened. Then I would think about my son sitting at the edge of his bed when he was 12, trying to explain why he didn't feel good enough at school. And I remember telling him to toughen up. The difference was in love. I loved my son deeply. The difference was awareness. With my soldiers, I knew they were developing. I expected immaturity. I expected mistakes. With my son, I expected gratitude and resilience without realizing those things have to be nurtured, not commanded. At 71, I finally had a conversation with him that I should have had years earlier. We were sitting at his kitchen table. He's a grown man now with children of his own. I told him I had been thinking about my years in the Army, about leadership, about responsibility. And I told him I was sorry. Not for serving, not for believing in discipline, but for sometimes confusing control with guidance, for assuming that providing was the same as connecting, for speaking to him like a subordinate when he needed a father. He didn't respond with anger. He didn't list grievances. He just nodded slowly and said, "I know you did the best you knew how." That sentence gave me both comfort and discomfort. Comfort because he saw my effort. Discomfort because he was right. I did the best I knew how, but knowing more earlier might have changed things. What I've learned in these later years is that leadership in uniform and fatherhood at home require different kinds of strength. In the military, clarity and consistency create stability. At home, presence and vulnerability create safety. I was very good at the first. I had to grow into the second. There's a quiet irony in realizing that the skills I refined in the Army could have served me better at home if I had softened them. Patience, mentorship, listening before correcting. I gave those things generously to young men who wore the same patch I did. I rationed them unintentionally with my own child. Aging has a way of removing your defenses. You begin to see patterns you once justified. You see how pride kept you from admitting uncertainty, how silence felt like authority, but sometimes landed as distance. I can't rewrite the past. None of us can, but I can choose how I show up now. I ask my son questions and wait for the full answer. I tell my grandchildren stories that include my mistakes, not just my accomplishments. I let them see that strength and tenderness are not opposites. If you're a father who has spent years carrying responsibility on your shoulders, especially in uniform, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me. The same effort you put into shaping disciplined young soldiers can be put into shaping trust at home. It just requires a different tone. At 71, I don't measure my life by rank anymore. I measure it by conversations, by whether my son calls me when something weighs on him, by whether he feels judged or understood when he sits across from me. I trained many good soldiers. I'm proud of that. But the work I'm most grateful for now is quieter. It's rebuilding a relationship that never broke completely but needed more care than I gave it. If you're listening to this and you still have time, use it. Speak softer when it matters. Listen longer than feels necessary. Leadership is important. Service is honorable. But the people at your own table will remember not how firm you were, but how present you chose to be. I learned that late. You don't have to.